Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mark Dirks, and on behalf of ACRL and Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, which is titled Emerging Library Trends in the FYE, New Ideas for Impacting Student Success, which is sponsored by Credo. Today's discussion is one in a series of sponsored webinars from ACRL and Choice that addresses new ideas, developments, and products of interest to the academic library community. Free to users, these structured 60-minute live presentations provide the opportunity for interactive discussions of important new issues and developments in academic librarianship by librarians, vendors, authors, and other interested stakeholders. Before we get started, I'd like to take a few moments to point out a few features of the webinar software. In the main area of the screen, you should be able to see the PowerPoint deck and follow along with the presentation materials. Along the right-hand side, you should see a Q&A panel and a chat panel. If you don't, you can click the buttons labeled Chat and Q&A in the upper right corner of the screen to activate the panels. Please use the Q&A panel to submit questions for our speakers. At the end of the presentation, they'll take a few minutes to answer your questions, so please feel free to send them in throughout. If you're experiencing any technical issues, that's what the chat panel is for, and you can use that to message me directly, and I'll troubleshoot the issue with you privately. Today, we're using the hashtag ACRL Choice Webinars during the event, so if you have another screen handy, shout out to us. We're at choice_reviews on Twitter. Also note that we are recording today's program, and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the archived version. All right, and our speakers today are Lauren Presley and Ray Pun. And Lauren Presley is the director of the UW-Tacoma Library and an associate dean of the University of Washington Libraries. She's responsible for strategic visioning, policy and program development, operations and personnel, and overall innovation and excellence in the UW-Tacoma Library. She provides leadership for transformational and user-centered services, integrated educational and curricular programs, staff development at all levels, an inclusive environment that also prioritizes diversity, responsive collections and information resources, assessment, and marketing of services. Lauren regularly publishes and presents on organizational change, the evolving information environment, and the future of libraries. She has served in several positions within the American Library Association, the Library Information Technology Association, the Horizon Project, and Library Pipeline, and most recently was elected Vice President/President-elect of the Association of College and Research Libraries. Lauren has been recognized with a Distinguished Alumna Early Career Award from the UNC Greensboro School of Education, as a Library Journal Mover and Shaker, and as an ALA Emerging Leader. She holds Bachelor of Arts degrees from North Carolina State University in Small Group and Interpersonal Communication and Philosophy, a Master of Library and Information Studies degree from UNC Greensboro, and is an alumna of the UCLA Senior Fellows Program. Ray Pun is the first-year student success librarian and doctoral student in educational leadership at California State University, Fresno. He has over 10 years of experience as a librarian and previously worked at New York University Shanghai and the New York Public Library Stephen A. Schwarzman Building. Ray has presented nationally and internationally and has published widely, including 4 edited volumes, such as the First Year Experience Cookbook and Asian American Librarians and Library Services. He is an active member of ALA, ACRL, CALA, REFORMA, and APALA. He is a recipient of numerous professional awards and recognitions, including the Library Journal's Mover and Shaker, ALA's Emerging Leaders, and SLA's Rising Stars, and Achievement in Academic Business Librarianship. Ray holds an MLS from City University of New York Queens College, an MA in East Asian Studies, and a BA in History from St. John's University. You can tweet him at RayPun101. All right, and I think, Ray, you have a few words to say here.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thanks, everyone, for joining us. I wanted to say that we are also having online conversations. I will be live tweeting some of them. And as Mark said, there's also the hashtag ACRL Choice Webinars to follow me and Lauren on Twitter. So from here, I will pass it to Lauren.
All right. Thank you very much for that introduction, Mark, and for the Twitter setup, Ray. And I wanted to thank all of you for being here today. We know that the first year of college is a significant transition, and it gives me such hope to know that so many people are willing and able to carve out time to think about how we can serve this population in more effective ways. I'm really here to provide an introduction to Ray's rich content and to share a bit on the importance of showcasing the library's values. And in our conversations in preparation for today, we determined it would make sense to talk about library value through the two lenses that I'm most familiar with: the Association of College and Research Libraries and the specific institution of the University of Washington-Tacoma. For a little bit of context, in case you're not familiar, ACRL is the higher education association for librarians, representing nearly 11,000 academic and research librarians, primarily from North America. We help academic and research librarians learn, innovate, and lead within the academic community. The University of Washington-Tacoma is part of the University of Washington's One Library, Three Campuses. UW-Tacoma was founded in 1990 and is identified as an urban serving university. Before talking about showcasing the value for my local institution, I wanted to briefly share a bit of context about the type of work and place that we are. UW-Tacoma's enrollment is a little over 5,000 students, 11% of whom are first year, but 58% of those first-year students are also first-generation college students. 73% of our students receive financial aid, and 10% receive veterans benefits. As you might imagine, this institution is extremely focused on student success. The library has worked to position itself as a critical partner in this work in a number of ways. We generate data for campus about library use, our instruction program, changes in reference interactions, and we've joined the Campus Data Fellows group to identify when it makes sense to integrate our data into campus systems and when it might not. We apply our expertise to the challenges that campus faces, for example, creating an annotated bibliography about retention for our Student Success Task Force to use in their work. We respond to student requests for new services, for example, generating a budget proposal to meet student requests for additional hours. But we're also proactive, for example, creating a textbook loan program that spans all of our majors. Fundamentally, though, the way we showcase our value in our local context has evolved in response to the position that we occupy within the campus community. All of our work is founded on relationships. For a relatively small campus, our library staff knows the campus community, and our campus community knows the members of our library staff. We have long-standing and good relationships, and those have enabled all of the library staff to be able to advocate for the role of the library in helping our students be successful. Those of us that are newer to the institution start out by building relationships, and we try to intentionally protect our newer librarians' time so that they have the flexibility to do this informal but essential work. Good relationships enable us to learn what our community is focused on, prioritizing, and often it gives us insight into things that will be happening in the future. These relationships also allow us to talk frankly with faculty and administrators about what the library needs in order to be able to provide the environment that our students deserve. They also allow us to think creatively about the role the library can play in campus priorities and how to evolve services when it's time to rethink them. In addition to the informal relationships we have with members of the community, we've also spent a fair bit of time over the last year clarifying our liaison program. The librarians met over a series of weeks to determine what was core and expected of liaisons and what would be nice to do if we had additional staff lines. Out of these conversations came a desire for an intentional communication plan, and that's something that we're working on developing this summer. Throughout all of this, our core message has been that the academic library is a catalyst for both student success and the research mission of the institution. We, of course, believe this, and we have plenty of anecdotal stories to share when making this case. But over the past few years, we've also leaned on the documentation coming out of the Value of Academic Libraries project to supplement our local stories and make the case to those that prefer more data-driven approaches, which has really led to us refining our own thinking about data and stories. We've evolved to a point where we're telling the same stories in a number of ways, making use of assessment data, qualitatively sharing student and faculty stories, generating infographics, and we're also beginning to tell stories in a wide range of channels, from meetings to campus-wide signage to rethinking our entire web communication strategy. And we see results from this work every year, and they're increasingly substantial results over time. All of this is to say that you have relationships on your campus. You likely have a liaison program that you can use to get your message out. So I figured I should spend a little bit of time sharing some of what ACRL offers to help bolster your local case regarding the role of your library in student success. Over the past 7 years, ACRL has been working on impact value. That is, what changes occur for students, faculty, and others as a result of the library. Our colleges and university administrators, government officials, and accrediting bodies are all increasingly asking questions about outcomes for the entire higher education sector. The Value of Academic Libraries project was developed to help when you're asked those specific questions. The Value of Academic Libraries project is built around the core ideas of developing professional competencies, fostering collaborative relationships, and documenting practices and strategies. And the website for this project is rich with documents that you can use to inform your practice or communicate with your campus. I, for one, rely on documentation from this project on a daily basis. Specifically within that, I'd like to call your attention to the Assessment and Action project. And this was fundamentally developed to build the professional competencies of librarians to document and communicate the value of their academic libraries, primarily in relation to their specific institution's goals for student learning and success. It was also designed to strengthen collaborative practices and contribute to assessment in the broader higher education context. All of this has resulted in a searchable online database of individual assessment and action team project reports, poster abstracts, and images. And you can use these both to develop new services that might make sense for your community, but also as data you can use in your own campus's conversations. And finally, I wanted to mention to you a newer project that ACRL is supporting, Project Outcome. And Project Outcome is a free toolkit that was originally developed to help public libraries understand and share the true impact of essential library services and programs by providing simple surveys and easy-to-use processes for measuring and analyzing outcomes. Project Outcome also provides libraries with the resources and training support needed to apply the results and confidently advocate for their library's future. The ACRL board approved the development of a Project Outcome toolkit designed specifically for academic libraries. This would not replace an in-depth assessment program that you might currently be using, but it could be extremely powerful if you're just building out your assessment program or if you want a lighter weight tool for specific projects. Currently, a task force is developing standard survey questions, and the Project Outcome for Academic Libraries will launch and host workshops at the next ACRL conference in Cleveland, April 2019. So I hope this framing around telling stories at your local context that makes sense for your own institution and talking about some of the tools you might be able to use from ACRL might be helpful in your thinking and might orient our way of thinking about how we would communicate our library's value for our own specific and unique context. And with that, I'm happy to turn this over to Ray.
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you, everyone, for joining this webinar. We're really pleased to have all of you to hear these really great ideas that we'll be sharing. And as Lauren pointed out, there's so much you can do with your campus partners and demonstrating the value of your library. And so when I was asked to participate in this webinar, I thought to myself, well, who is it for? Which university is this for? You know, we have different universities with different needs. You have those who are belonging in the Association of Research Libraries, the ARL, including the Ivy Leagues. Those who are not in the ARL, the community colleges and those private liberal arts, public state schools, regional schools, and so forth. And we have to think about the acronym FYE and how does it apply to these contexts. Not every university will think FYE the same way. We are also thinking about HIP, which stands for High Impact Practice. And it's another acronym just like ROI, which is the things that are in conversation. And we need to think about what do these acronyms mean? Do they even mean anything to our first-year students? Probably not, because they're just acronyms, but they mean something to many of us in the library profession. So when we think about this, these acronyms, really, we have to think about our values and impact and how they may align and support them. And in some ways, I think it's important to reduce these acronyms, these jargons and codes in our messages, in our marketing, flyers, tools, and then thinking about the languages and speaking to the thoughts of students that are coming in today. And so you could see here, there's just a word cloud, and there's tons of acronyms I've included. And some of them you might know, and some of them you might not. But the main three ones, obviously, we're going to look at is FYE, HIP, and ROI. And so the book itself that's coming out, which is what we're covering today is looking at Credo's best practices for that instruction, and to really engage with all of our communities of practice, really introducing these different areas for all the librarians out there and library workers who are interested in supporting first-year students in orientation, collaboration, IL, assessment, and student engagement. And we're going to be looking at each of these sessions today. And so it's open access, and it will come out at the end of this month. So you're welcome to download the chapters that are there right now, but we are right now refining it and revising it, and it's quite exciting to be part of this project to ensure that these activities and exercises are addressed and also are implemented by other institutions. We also have several case studies as well, and so we'll be reviewing some of them. So the first poll I have for all of you, if you've been to many of my webinars, you know I like to do some polls here and there. I like to ask all of you if you've done orientations for these groups. You can feel free to check all that applies, from first year to transfer to international to online learners and summer bridge. So Mark, if you can set up the poll, that would be great. So as we are polling, I wanted to say that for many of us, we tend to want to have support for orientations for these students. Why do we do it? Well, we do it because we want students to know more about these resources and services we have, but also to make them feel a sense of belonging, right? Knowing that this space will be theirs to use, to study, feel comfortable, and really engage with our collections and services. And so many folks, I'm going to guess right now, will probably hit first-year students and possibly online and distance students. But maybe this poll will prove me wrong. And for those who are not familiar with Summer Bridge, it's a special program designated for underrepresented and low socioeconomic background students to be part of this special program right before the first semester of their first year program. And they're usually first generation students, and they're able to get really a boost to learn more about the study skills before they start first year. All right, wow. So of course, first year students, 347, not a surprise. Some folks on the lower end with Summer Bridge, and oh, good number for international students, and 167 for transfer students. Great, so different levels, and thank you for your participation. It gives me some ideas on how do I speak to those in those other areas that are not being supported. So this chapter, as I mentioned, is focusing on different levels of orientations, right? And we have those who are in Summer Bridge. Those who are not doing it, you might want to take a look. I believe we'll be adding more on international students, and there's some on transfer students. And the whole purpose is really to think about the relations between students utilizing the space and who are not familiar with library spaces at all. So when we think about today's changed FYE spaces, you know, we have to think about how and if it's parallel to first year experiences. So we know, obviously, from a lot of anecdotes and from our own experiences, students today have different needs, attentions, and backgrounds. And we might want to think about how to deconstruct and reconfigure library spaces to meet those needs of these students. And in some ways, I think it's imperative for us to dispel this myth that higher education was not designed to serve the needs of students today. Obviously, we need to work quite hard and collaboratively to do that. But we also, which is the challenging part, find a great balance to support those needs for those current students, the faculty, the graduate students, and all the other students who are not first-year students. And how do we approach it? So in the chapter itself, we look at different case studies, obviously, but we need to think about the strategies to focus on spaces that can help rethink what is possible and what can be changed. So when we think about the orientations, this is just a general idea of orientations for all. We obviously want everybody to be involved, to know about our services, our spaces, our resources, certainly, but even looking at the poll, not everyone is doing orientations for all of them. So we need to think about how do we customize and support them individually. And then we might end up doing orientations for some of the groups, which is, I think, the case right now. We can't extend our services, or there's limited resources and so forth. But if we think about the campus partners, the relationships we have with other stakeholders, by marketing these orientation services collaboratively, we can really support those who might be able to not see this library in a way that we see it. So I'll definitely share some examples. And of course, there's some that we might be doing orientations that don't fit for anyone. This is actually quite interesting because when we do orientations, we obviously just think, one glove fit all. It's actually not the case. We need to really customize and think through of our services. So here are just a couple of examples. At Fresno State, I work closely with our different campus partners on the left. It's a short video, under 3 minutes. And it was used, and it's still used in dog days and what we call it for our incoming orientations for first-year students. And it just shows exactly who are the library folks, but also the services and also the other kinds of resources that are in the library. So we have services for students with disabilities, the tutoring center, and all of these other resources that are not necessarily part of the library, but it's in the library. But we have to showcase them because this is a way to show what we have available. And it's a great way for our online learners and anyone who might not be able to make it for our Welcome Week, which is on the right, which is basically a photo booth of different kinds of services that we generally open and offer in the beginning of the school year, which many of you are probably doing. So in addition to these photo booths, there are scavenger hunts, tours, introductory workshops, and depending on your context and resources, these efforts can be collaborative, meaning you work with student affairs and other departments to collectively support these efforts. So when we think about Summer Bridge, you don't have to do it alone. You can work with the Summer Bridge office, transfer student office, international student office to really sustain these efforts. And this is where we want to encourage folks to think about orientations for all, but in a way that's specified and really scalable and sustainable. So this is the second chapter we have. It's on collaboration. It's actually a fun chapter. I really am pleased to demonstrate the levels of collaborations out there to support student success, to support teamwork within your own department. We have a section, an exercise, how public and technical services can work together to really engage students and really raise that awareness of library resources. And when we do collaborations, we really start demonstrating the high impact practices, which is something I had described earlier, active learning techniques to support student success and retention. And this is really important. It was inspired by my former provost, Lynette Selesny, who is now the president at California State University, Bakersfield, really honing in on supporting high impact practices through different means. And we're going to go through some of them. But what's great about collaboration is that you start defining the library's role for those who are not familiar with it, so different campus partners. And many of you might be familiar with this. So for my experience, I work with different student affairs groups and so forth. And some of them end up telling me, wow, I didn't know the library can do this. I didn't know I can use the library for my own help or to help me with orientation needs and so forth. So I think it's really exciting times to really reimagine what the library can do for these campus partners. And this is what the chapter is about. So as I mentioned, high impact practices are great ways to embed library services into these curriculums. So if your university is looking into that and have been really defining them by the Association of American Colleges and Universities, then you'll know and you'll be familiar with some of these high impact practices. So first year experiences, learning communities, writing intensive courses, and so forth. And what they do is they really help students in the first year and undergraduate experience succeed. There's a lot of research demonstrated to this. I don't have to get into all of them, but I will say that for the most part, they really can be integrated into what we're doing right now. And I'm going to actually explain some of them in a case study. And before I do that, I wanted to mention that some of these high impact practices can also be mapped out together. So you have first year experiences that could tie closely with service learning or internships, something with diversity and global learning, connecting with learning community, and also undergraduate research with capstone projects. So when I say this, I mean that the efforts that the library can provide can hit these areas as well for one single course or for a whole program in itself. And we're going to show some of these examples in just a bit. But first, here is poll number 2. Who are your favorite campus collaborators in FYE? So we listed several of them. Obviously, there are other groups, but feel free to check one of them off. And Mark, if you can set it up. Oh, great, it's up already. That'd be great. So at Fresno State, we call our tutoring center actually Learning Center. But I think that is more clearer about that role of the department. Right, we'll give it possibly less than a minute here. So when we think about campus collaborators, we tend to think about obviously the traditional academic groups, such as teaching faculty, the writing center, and I could see here the tutoring center, wow, 8%, the student groups and clubs, 5%, student affairs, 18%, which is faring better, and other groups, 3%. So thank you for participating in that. That's actually quite interesting to see that there is growing numbers for those who are in tutoring and writing center. And so for what we do at Fresno State, one of the things is working closely with our writing center. Here's just one example. And it supports undergraduate research and so forth. When the library participates specifically with research services, working closely with the writing center, we have librarians and writing tutors come together in an event called Write-In, which many of you are probably familiar with. It's an event where we support research and writing services at the same time. So if a student comes in, whether they're undergraduate first year or graduate students, they can get this kind of help right away. They can meet with a writing tutor or a research librarian, and then they can continue talking to another person if they need it. All of these events are held in the library, and it's a great way to build that collaboration, to support writing intensive courses. So we market it out, we send it out to many courses out there, especially in the first year. And we also send it out to our tutoring centers in case they get filled up and they can refer students over. And so it's a really great way to foster that collaboration between the two groups that have a lot in common. And we know that there are a lot of books and so forth on this collaboration, but this is to just show you exactly what you can do as a starter by hosting these write-ins in your library during critical periods of the semester. You really start demonstrating the library's value and impact in students' learning. And you can even take it a step further. This is something we had done this past semester, organizing closely on the left with the Writing Across Curriculum and the Writing Center in a conference. So we had an undergraduate writing conference where there were students who showcased posters, talks, and there were awards you can see on the right. And the award itself really came from the library's effort to recognize undergraduate research and writing prizes. And really it was to also honor and really recognize those undergraduate papers, because we tend to not see that there's a lot of good work being done in the undergraduate level. So you can take it one step further and even organize a conference in the library and have students showcase their work. And so I worked closely with one of our English professors who was the co-organizer, and we had many judges and recruiters in terms of getting students to submit for the awards and for the posters. And then we also had a special documentary room where students from an education class showcase their literacy projects. And then the write-in, of course, you see there. All of this culminates into the experiences of how the library can support high-impact practices through collaboration, supporting undergraduate research, writing intensive courses, and it's a great way to showcase the library's value on campus, because now you're working with all different stakeholders all at once, and of course, this in itself really recognizes the library's role and so forth. So I wanted to say that this was a fun chapter. I encourage you all to spend more time taking a look at it to get more ideas, because it really helps you think more about student groups as well. So we also had different student groups collaborating with us on all the other sorts of activities. So now we move on to information literacy, which is the third chapter. And of course, this is something that we are all familiar with. And the chapter in itself is also filled with a lot of new information that you may not be familiar with. So for example, we have Lisa Janke-Fliff. She is at University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She basically wrote doing preliminary research results of a qualitative study to determine what librarians believe are first-year students' misconceptions related to information literacy. So there's a huge interview, and it's really great, and she's doing a follow-up research on this. And so some of these misconceptions could be thinking that the students come into the library using their spaces but didn't know about the resources, or they think all library resources are credible or so forth. And so all of this can tie into what we think about information literacy today. And the chapter itself is quite packed with a lot of exercises and activities, from fake news to all these other techniques to looking at different frames and how do you integrate into your practice. So I wanted to focus more on the strategic impact and really thinking about information literacy, rethinking about it for first-year students, and thinking about the resources, how students develop life skills along with information literacy skills. So life skills might include financial literacy or health and wellness and so forth. And you know, these basically can have a strategic impact on student learning. Basically, it also comes down to campus literacy. I've seen some modules in some other institutions where they include that information. Basically, where is the writing center? Do they know that there's health and wellness and counseling available for students? Did they know that they can have these resources available outside of the library? So campus literacy seems to be an interesting way of introducing information literacy to first-year students, because you're helping students feel comfortable and knowing more about the library, but also developing these key skills for research. Collaboratively designing first-year information literacy outcomes with different stakeholders. So in our example here at Fresno State, we've worked closely with our writing center for those write-ins, but also with our first-year seminar, our first-year writing program. And so really thinking about what information literacy means to them, especially in the first year, and then how do we design those outcomes and programs. And it's really critical to work with them so then they can see what the value is for library's role in supporting that. So you can bring them together in a focus group and have a monthly meeting. They could be your advisory group to really steer the library's effort for first-year information literacy outcomes. And then you can also think about really the different types of students that are in your schools. So first-generation students, students who have never been to a library. As a first-generation student myself, I luckily have used the public library back in New York, where I was from, and had worked in one, obviously. But I really didn't know that the library had course reserves or all these kinds of resources that are available. Transfer students, school partnerships. I know there's a lot of these resources out there in terms of supporting high school students that are coming into your school, special gateway programs, including Upward Bound or Summer Bridge. And when you think about the student learning for these groups, you really have to start thinking about how different they're going to develop these information literacy skills. And it's also important to think about the types of literacies out there, right? We talked about financial, but there's also digital, multimedia, data, and as I mentioned, campus literacies. So when you're thinking about student learning, I think it's important to know that all the students coming in today do not learn the same way or have been taught and learned things differently, have not been exposed, have different experiences. And it's important to realize that and possibly integrate some of these ideas into your own practice, whether they're modules or in person and so forth. And so for my role, for instance, I had taught a lot of academic success workshops with our tutoring center, and they focus on multimedia resources to data literacy to visual literacy. These are just general drop-in workshops, but the students are required to come in if they are in this learning center or if they're at risk services in that kind of zone. So it's quite a great experience to collaborate with these different stakeholders. Then they could see, wow, the library can also teach different kinds of resources, not just using database demos, which is traditionally what we are really great at. And when we think about different techniques, there are different ways to promote and support student learning. So for instance, team teach technique. This is an example we had just done this past semester. I worked with our education librarian and our English librarian. And the education librarian supports graduate students, and the English librarian supports students who are in English. And we worked together to teach a workshop for graduate students who are first-year writing instructors. So you can see it's a triage sort of a approach where we supported students, those students who are teaching first-year writing. And what's interesting is that then they start learning how do we train the trainer approach. Like we're training them to think about how they teach first-year writing and information literacy in there. We're not saying that they completely teach information literacy, but what's happening is that they're working with us to have a stronger knowledge of information literacy basics, so that if they can sort of troubleshoot at the spot, they can do that instead of just referring to the librarians, which we're happy to help with. But I think this was a way for them to know more about the resources. Train-the-trainer approach, obviously some of your students are going to be very familiar with the resources available because they've been in special programs or in Summer Bridge, so they might be aware of these resources. You might want to work with them, and if you can find that information beforehand, to have them lead the workshops with you. I've had students where I had to ask if they've been attending a lot of the workshops before, and they have, and I have them come up and do demos with me. And it's, of course, scary for them, but after a while they see, oh, it's not so bad. But it's also a great way for them to showcase their public speaking, especially those communication classes, where a lot of them have already taken a first-year information literacy class or some sort of a workshop that I have taught before. Peer coaching and teaching is another great way to get students to teach each other in group settings. So you can do this in a number of ways, from using Wikipedia, for instance. We had this example at this past semester with Women's Studies 101. All the students were working in groups, and they were teaching each other how to find library resources and editing Wikipedia at the same time. So if you can sort of formulate this approach where students can work in groups, especially for first-year students, it becomes more meaningful, I believe. And one of the things we have to remember is the universal design for learning and accessibility. I think this can be a webinar in itself. I don't need to get into every detail, but we do need to remember that the students have different learning needs. They see and learn things differently than we assume. So we need to be quite cognitive, like aware of that. And so, for instance, if you're doing online modules, you need to think about captions and the way the texts are placed. And you need to think about those students who have these different learning needs. And particularly those who are doing a lot of database demos and one-shots, it's better to really speak what you're doing as opposed to just pointing. So we all have a habit of doing that. So obviously these are just little things to consider and think about when we're teaching these students who are having different needs and try to accommodate them. So in terms of being strategic about it, I think this is important to consider. So when we think about what to teach and how to teach, I think one important area, and we cover this in the chapter, is social justice. And so it really is important because it covers multiple perspectives. It's an interdisciplinary study, but also raises the questions of information equity. And using these interactive tools, such as mind mapping tool, as you see here, to like Cephalonian methods, which many of you might be familiar with, image-based, driven way of engaging with students. You might be able to have students really think through some of these topics that are really important today in society. And they work really well, particularly those who are in first year. Then they start thinking collectively and reflecting on these issues. And what are the library resources saying? What do we have and what don't we have? And having them really think through this, possibly in a think, pair, share, or you can have them write a 1-minute reflection card. So meaning having them sort of reflect at the end after you do a demonstration on finding resources relating to topic social justice or breaking down into these other areas, then you can start having students really reflect on them. I think that's really key about what's going on today in this really important digital era. There's constantly information overflowing, but are they reflecting them? Are they consuming them in a way that is thoughtful? And how does it impact them in that context? So I encourage everyone here to really think about framing social justice in your library instruction, particularly in the first year. And now we move on to this chapter here, assessment. This is the 4th chapter. It's actually quite a challenging one, I will admit, when I was writing this with Credo team, because it's one that I think falls into different categories. Lauren had really introduced a lot of great tools and case studies from her university. And so for many of us, I think we need to think about privacy, issues of privacy, the data we're collecting, the analytics involved, the tools. And of course, we mentioned that in the chapter because we want to be mindful and respectful. And at the same time, we want to also demonstrate the library's impact on student learning. How are we elevating the library's visibility? And can assessment be used as a marketing tool? As Lauren pointed out, there are many ways, and we'll emphasize some of that in this chapter. And we think about assessment, we think about return on investment, ROI, in libraries. And it's quite interesting because obviously this is a neoliberal concept. Like, are we doing this so that we can get more resources? Are we doing this to justify what we're doing? And obviously, yes, and we deal with these questions almost every year or every semester and so forth. And it's not necessarily new. ALA President Jim Neal, he wrote an article in 2011 for the ACRL conference. It's observing the neoliberal context in libraries today, academic libraries today. And it's something that I think we're sort of wrestling with, right? Because we want to be impactful, but at the same time, how do we do more with less? How do we rethink our priorities and directions that are not designated from the library administration, but from the campus administration? And how do we grapple with the lack of institutional support? So of course, this is where assessment comes in, and these are some other ways to think about it, because the return on investment can be really helpful to think beyond financial values and transactions. We don't want to just hone in on metrics. Obviously, it's important to gather that data, but at the same time, we don't want to think of it like it's a zero-sum game, like someone's going to win, someone's going to lose. We're trying to actually think about the impact of what we're doing. And I believe there's some other discussions and literature going on the value on investment, right? Like, how do we invest on these values to demonstrate our impact? And when we think about these financial values and transactions, moving beyond that, we can design these kinds of studies to uncover students' perceptions and attitudes of the library. So like what Lisa had mentioned, basically looking at information literacy, the misperceptions of it. This is something that we can do more of today in terms of the micro-studies. And how do we do that? Well, we can do that in a number of ways, focusing on the students' experiences, reducing those organizational, physical, and policy barriers in the library. So I wanted to say that I had worked with our students, services for students with disabilities, as well as our advocates for students with disabilities, student group. And we, I went there to their meetings outside of the library in the student club, and then they were impressed. They were shocked because they never had anybody in the library talk to them. This was about 2 years ago, and their main concerns was about the elevator we had in the south wing. And this was prior to a renovation we had in the library at the state. And they were concerned that the library wasn't accessible, it wasn't safe, and one of the students actually got trapped. And that was unbelievable hearing that. And for them to know that I was there to hear their stories and then bring it back to our library administration and campus administration, and then of course leading up to the changes that we had, really made them feel that the library was there for them to really reduce these organizational barriers. And so I encourage everyone to think about the micro-studies and how do you increase student experiences and also reveal what are they feeling, the sentiments. And of course, you want to collaborate, as I mentioned, with different student affairs groups to student clubs and community organizations. You'll learn that return on investment in terms of collaborating with them and really supporting their needs can really bring in that impact, show that impact that the library can have at that level, and then collectively it might be more valuable in that sense. So now we have our third and final poll. I wanted to ask here, do you have student advisory group for the library? Yes, no, yes, but in the past, but defunct now. And as you're filling out this poll, I wanted to say that at Fresno State, where I worked, I organized a library advisory group for first-year students. It's not a new concept necessarily. A lot of universities have it. It's a great way to steer where the library is heading and getting their input. And so at Fresno State, I had a bunch of first-year students, and you're probably wondering, how did I get them? So I got them through advisors. I met them through other people's siblings, the student assistants, and then their siblings were first-year students. And then they were part of it to really share their input. So I really encourage folks to think about that. But at the same time, let's see how this poll works and see how many folks respond to this. Wow, so a lot of them had said no, 240 yes for 75, and it used to be active and now it isn't, 39 voters. Thank you for participating. So for those who are who don't have a student advisory group, this one came from Furman College. I found a really nice flyer to encourage folks to come in. Really think about building those relations with first-year students. They can serve as library ambassadors, help design user experience assessments. So in terms of having them serving in focus groups, in-depth interviews, and having them really be the spokesperson, really, and holding them accountable as well. So if there's something that is not right with the signage or not clear with the space, they can tell you, and then in some ways have them feel that they are accountable and the space belongs to them, they're using it, and so forth. It really helps make a difference to their lives because then it helps them feel that they can use this library space and it's for them. And of course, there are different levels of student advisory groups you can do. As someone pointed out, a graduate level or undergraduate level, but I have done one just for first years, just to see what are their interests. And we know, for instance, Snapchat is in, Instagram is sort of fading out. So these kinds of little information can be helpful to continuously refine your practice. And when you're communicating your impact and assessment, as Lauren mentioned, you can use infographics like what we have here, collecting this data. Of course, you want to get consent and be mindful of them, but thinking about the other formal practices, reports, presentations, emails, sharing that information out there so that people are aware of what's going on, what works, and how you communicate what you found, whether they're descriptive or exploratory data. There's a lot of infographic tools that we share in this chapter that are free, and you're welcome to take a look at them. Really great way to market the library's assessment and impact, and for you to really present them so that you continue demonstrating what you're doing and extending that. So this is a great opportunity for that kind of work. Now we are hitting into the final chapter. We have about 10 minutes in, so I will say that this is my favorite chapter. This is student engagement. It's the fun chapter left last, really focusing on programs, initiatives. Of course, some of them really overlaps with collaboration in other areas, but this is a great way to promote that opportunity for students who are figuring out their majors, for the non-academic planning, and for that sense of belonging, and for students to feel like this is a library that is responding to their needs. So as someone who had worked at the public library, it is all about user engagement and public engagement. I think it's critical for academic libraries to think about programming, to think about the needs of our campus, because that in itself also plays into the library's value. It's not new per se, it's not necessarily a trend, but I think some of the activities that you'll see here are becoming important areas to consider. So for instance, we have here some of these student engagements and interactions, right? How do we connect them to the majors? How do we foster teamwork, self-development? And some examples, obviously you see here like hackathons, collaborative exhibits, are some things that people have done already, but some other ones include food security. I know some libraries out there that are providing spaces for students to get meals, get food because let's be real here, textbooks are outrageous, tuition is outrageous, and some of our students have to choose between paying for rent, paying for groceries, or paying for textbooks. Let's sort of think about how the library can be that supportive space and supportive service, because it's a way to really reflect on our user needs and ensuring that they are retained and they succeed without these barriers that are existing externally. And another one that I didn't list here is really creating a campaign video featuring first-generation students, faculty, and staff to share their campaign challenges, that sense of belonging, right? Like, what are their challenges when they were a first-year generation students? You can have all of these opportunities to engage with your first-year students. And here are some other ones: gaming nights, paint nights, lactation room. This is something that I think we tend to forget. There are a lot of student parents, and it's something I would encourage folks to think about creating a space. I believe in Fresno State, in our library, we are looking into that as well. And this one, legal clinics for undocumented students. I heard this at a conference in the California State University, Northridge. They had mentioned that they work with local legal services to provide support for undocumented students in the library at certain times in really private areas. So this is a great way to really think about what the library can do to expand its services and role from traditional boundaries. And prayer and meditation room is obviously another critical area. If you have done your assessment and survey and you realize that this is important for students to de-stress and so forth, and get that sense of belonging. But wait, it's not just for students. You can also do really exciting things with your colleagues to build morale, to really build that teamwork. So I mentioned here edible book fairs, and I want to mention here this project. This is from Eastern Illinois University, Top Runs, who is the institutional repository librarian there, organized this for about over 5 years, which is basically showcasing books in different meal formats. So this one is Lord of the Fries. It looks kind of funny, but there's some other really interesting ones. And they put this exhibit in the library, and then they have other participants, whether they are students or faculty, really engaging with the content there. And it's a really fun way to build morale in terms of if you wanted to do something in the library space, you can create an edible book festival in the library and give out these resources and see what people come up with. So I really commend Todd and his group to doing this kind of activity because it raises awareness of the library's creativity and engagement with students and literature. And here's something that I wanted to emphasize here as a Library Diversity Committee. Many of you may have one in your institution or maybe in a campus level. We have one at Fresno State. We work closely with many stakeholders, many outreach groups, and we go out there and do poster presentations, we do events, public programming, exhibits collaboratively to design and foster diversity, inclusivity, and multiculturalism, because that's what we want people to know, to recognize the library for these kinds of efforts. And you're welcome to check our website. We have a lot of great things we have done over the years. But what's great is that this is a team effort, just like the Edible Book Fair. It's all team efforts. It's not just obviously for our students, but it's for all of us to really be involved, to really take a stance and support these values that the library can truly represent. So some concluding thoughts here. Impacting FYE. So you probably have a lot of ideas, or I've given you a lot of thoughts to think about. We really want to focus on self-efficacy and a sense of belonging for first-year students. Can they feel that they belong in this library, in this campus as first generation, and coming in and developing the skills that they need? Are they able to navigate the library and its resources? Can we create those connections to majors and non-academic planning? So, for instance, you can have those first-year student advisory groups and ask them, what are their challenges with their majors? Are we doing student engagement programs to reflect their majors? Are we reaching out to computer science students for first years? Can we do a hackathon working with technology services? So these are some general ideas in addition to building a tiered information literacy and assessment programs. Obviously, it's not one glove fit all, but really working with different stakeholders and making it sustainable and scalable is the way to go. And forming those teamworks with your colleagues, with different groups, collaborations, and partnerships. I think we're hitting at a time where this is really crucial to demonstrate our value when we work with others and then we change that perception that they have, that the library only has books, it's only for research, but actually we can do all kinds of things to support life skills, from financial literacy to project management to public speaking. So I think these are critical times that the library can support to impact FYE. So I wanted to end here to give time for questions and comments. And for those who were able to join us, thank you so much. And I'll pass back to Mark.
Great, and this is Mark. We do have a few minutes here for some questions. So if you have questions for Ray or Lauren, I would encourage you to drop those into the Q&A box so that all of us can see them there. And we already have a few in the hopper, I believe, so let me take a look at those. And it looks like we have, let's see, we've got a bunch here. So one question I believe that came in a bit earlier that says a question for Ray from Caroline. Says, any thoughts about direct assessment for information literacy or ROI, maybe working with the institutional research office or something like that? Do you have any additional thoughts on that, Ray?
Yeah, that's a great question on working with ROI. I think those are great ways to get the descriptive data. Obviously, we want to be mindful. It's a lot of data, student data we're working with, but in terms of accreditation, that's really critical. But in terms of the first year, it's something that you can do in the beginning of the semester. My colleague, Matt, he had started gathering incoming first-year students and then using that as a benchmark. And I was able to use that data to really help inform my practices going forward.
Great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We've got a question here from Simon, I believe, who asks, does the guide target professional library staff exclusively, or does it also value the role library support staff can play in the activities and goals it presents? What do you think, Ray?
So did you say library guide?
Yes, I believe so. Yep.
Okay. So if they're referring to the Credo guide, yeah, it actually supports all kinds. You don't necessarily have to be quote-unquote librarian. This is a guide, an open access publication that helps build a learning community for all of us to really think about the exercises and activities for student retention, success, and instruction. So a lot of the collaborations are open to anyone to start running with them.
Sure, that makes sense. That's great. We've got a question here from Janice, which I think is pretty interesting. And Janice says, there are so many great ideas here, but obviously we can't do all of them. How do you decide which will have the biggest impact? How do you prioritize? And maybe do each of you have some ideas on that?
I'm happy to chime in here. I would say that in my local context, that is the way of all of our work. There's so many interesting things we could be doing and very limited time to do it. So we make a lot of our decisions by having conversations with different campus stakeholders and then coming together as a group to talk about all the different variables at play and make a decision together about where we want to put our energy.
Yeah, that makes sense. Please jump in, Ray. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, yeah, that's a hard thing to consider in terms of the priorities. I think it's a lot of conversations to have, and then see if you can cross-list them, like cross-channel them, because in some ways there are a lot of it are duplicate efforts, but in some ways there are great ways to embed. Maybe you can't fully be invested in a hackathon, but if there's a way to create a LibGuide, which I did, I was actually able to attend our hackathon and just collaborate informally like that. Those are great ways to see what you can do and then build on it further.
Absolutely. And we've got, let me see here. A question that just recently came in from Winnie, I think is sort of an interesting one. And Winnie asks, inadequate space hinders things like having a prayer or meditation room, and how do you overcome those sort of space programs while you focus on those sorts of programming, those sorts of programs?
Yeah, that's a question to have with your campus stakeholders and your student groups, because obviously we want to preserve library spaces for library services and resources. But at the same time, if we're not able to sort of pivot in a way where the students feel like they can really rely on the library and say that the library is there for them, I think it's going to be harder for us to really demonstrate the value for the students. They're not going to remember the time that they studied in the library. They're going to remember the time when the library had the service that met their needs and so forth, which is really specific and crucial. And I think it's something you have to have conversations with. We have our conversations with many campus stakeholders, and they bring the ideas to us, and that's how we were able to do, for instance, the prayer and meditation room in our library with our cross-cultural and gender center.
I would also like to add that something that we're looking at doing and that we're sort of piloting right now is carving out a space of the library for people to come in seasonally. So we're not permanently giving up space for advising or career services or any other office on campus, but at the points in the year where it matters to have financial aid or to have resume support, we can bring in campus partners at those points, and students know the library will always have whatever it is that they're dealing with at that moment.
That's very interesting. That's great. And I think we'll take one more question here because we're coming to the end of our time, and we have far more questions than we could possibly get to, which is a great problem to have. I think one of the more recent questions that came in is from Jeremy, and Jeremy says, all of this requires time. What do you do if you just have enough staff that you're able to deal with what's already going on, that you're sort of treading water? And what do you think? And I think maybe, Ray, that ties into what you were talking about a moment ago when you mentioned that folks come to you with their ideas and their programs, things that they need. Do you have any thoughts for Jeremy?
Yeah, that's a question I always think about, how and why, and all the questions I get is, do I sleep? Is there more than one of me? And all this other stuff. But I will say that it's important to cultivate those relationships with peer ambassadors, other student groups. I've had really great students I've worked with when they were first year, now they're in their third year, and when I tell them that there's these events, they show up and they want to help me. And it's building those trusts. And I know not everyone has those experiences or skill sets to do so, but I think it just requires a lot of time management, but also communication with different folks. I don't know, I think for me it just comes out really naturally to work with many different groups, and then telling them what I'm able to contribute, and then sharing and distributing equity in terms of the work. And of course, with limited resources and budgets, you have to really think, well, what is really critical? But it doesn't hurt to give it a try, right? Like, it's always important to think outside of the box and try to innovate when you can.
And I just want to interject for a campus where I don't believe we have library staff that we need to support all of the student needs. So we have a lot of very structured conversations around how we want to evolve our existing services in order to free up time to meet new needs that are emerging on campus. So sometimes that might mean having some hard conversations about what does liaisonship look like, what does instruction look like, how do we develop collections, specifically to free up the time necessary to meet other emergent needs.
Yeah, that's great. That sounds like a great note to end on there. So I will say thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Ray, for taking the time today to present on FYE. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, and I would just point out before we sign off that we did record today's program, so all of those folks asking questions about that, you can be on the lookout for an email coming from ACRL and Choice with a link to that, to the recording. And I would just mention before we sign off here that we do have a quick survey that I would encourage you to take so that you can let us know how we did. You should see a link to that in the chat box coming through for you. So please take, just the 1 or 2 minutes it'll take you to do that. And thank you to everyone out there who signed in today. We appreciate your time. I hope you enjoyed the session and learned as much as I did. And I hope the rest of your day is great.